Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be comparing my San Martin SN004-G limited edition with my Tudor Black Bay 58. Firstly, let's consider the price difference between the two pieces. The 004 is €240, the 58 is €3,640 respectively, so a massive price difference between these two pieces. Firstly, we'll compare the two boxes and then we'll look at the items one gets with each piece, and then I'll talk you through the specification differences and compare them side by side. So this is the 004 watch box, plastic pelican style case, and with the watch one gets a spring bar tool, a screwdriver, and also a plastic warranty card, as you can see, and an owner's instruction manual. So with regards to the 58, one gets a cardboard outer box, one removes the lid, and I'll show you the watch box inside. This is the watch box. As you can see, it's made from plastic and plastic vinyl coated, and inside I'll show you the items one gets with it. Plastic warranty card, guarantee booklet, and owner's instruction manual. So really there's not that much difference with regards to the other items because they both come with plastic guarantee cards. Now the difference is the 004 limited edition is exclusively available from watch dives. Usually San Martin watches are covered by a 2-year international warranty, but buying a watch from watch dives they cover it by a 3-year warranty. The Black Bay 58 is covered by a 5-year international warranty, so one is getting an additional 2 years of cover. But the plastic warranty cards themselves actually are quite similar, although this is circular and this is a rectangle. Now with regards to the owner's instruction manuals, again they're not that different. They're cardboard booklets, as you can see. This one's a circle, this one's a rectangle, but really in terms of the quality of the high definition pictures, the instructions in English and the details of operating the movements, they're not actually that different despite the massive price difference. Right, so they're the two watch boxes. Well, the Tudor watch box is clearly higher quality as one would expect, but of course it's a much more expensive piece. Now, with regards to the heft, they're very close. The 004 is 147 grams, the 58 is 146 grams. There is only 1 gram of difference in the heft, and on wrist they feel exactly the same. They have the same comfort level and they also have the same feel-good factor because the dimensions are very close. The 004 has a 38.5mm case diameter, the 58 has a 39mm case diameter, so there's only 0.5 millimeter in difference between their case diameters. But the 004 actually wears exactly the same as the 39 because it has a slight bezel overhang. The bezel is 39mm, and as you can see visually they look very similar. With regards to visual differences, the main difference is the text on the dial of the 58 is printed in silver. The chapter ring is silver, and also the logo, the shield, and also the specification is all in silver. On the 004 it's all in white chapter ring, white San Martin hex and white specification. I prefer the silver printing on the Black Bay 58. Now it is subtle, and it's something that one notices after wearing the watch for some time, that the text isn't actually white, it's silver. I think the silver looks more classy, but having said that, I do also like the contrast of the white text and white hex on the 004. Now, the dimensions are very close. The most notable difference between the two dimensions is the 004 is 13.3mm thick, but the 58 is only 12mm, so it's 1.3mm thinner. And that is notable on wrist because the 13.3 does wear taller and therefore it does feel more top heavy on wrist, although the flanks do look very similar to the 58. So this is 1.3mm taller. On the 58 it's more slender. The profile of the flanks to the case are very similar, but it has a thinner coin edge bezel, similar profile to the double dome sapphire crystal, but it is noticeable that this is only 12mm. It's a very thin low profile piece. Now the bracelets are the same dimensions. They have a 20mm lug width, and the female pivoted end links work very well with the case. As you can see, very similar female pivoted end links. The bracelets taper from 20 down to 16 at the clasp, so exactly the same taper. They also have the same bevel machined on the edge of the case, which marks the transition between the top of the lug and the flanks. So as you can see, St. Martin have done a good job of making homage to the 58 because the bevels look very similar. But there is one notable difference with regards to the finishing. On the 004 it has a brushed satin finish to the flanks, which gives it a more tool watch aesthetic. But I prefer on the 58 because it has mirror polish flanks, as you can see, and this gives it a more classy dress watch look. And I actually think it's a better contrast having brushed satin finish to the tops of the lugs and mirror polish flanks versus brushed satin finishing to the flanks. So that's something I would prefer St. Martin to do on the 004 using mirror polished flanks. Now, with regards to the finishing, the 58 is clearly finished to a higher level. It's finished to Rolex level. The mirror polishing is done to a higher standard, the brushed satin finishing is done to a higher standard, and one can see this is evident on the bracelet because although the 004 is finished to a very high standard, there is a beautiful lustre to the 316L grade stainless steel. It's evident when one looks at the Black Bay 58s. They brush satin finish to a finer level. One can see the grained finish of the 316L grade stainless steel, and it just has a better luster. It has a finer sheen to it. It's more reflective. It looks more silver rather than being a grey satin dull finish. So the quality of the brush satin finishing on the 58 is higher. With regards to the flanks, this uses the rivet link bracelet. Personally, I would prefer if it had an oyster bracelet, but the mirror polishing again is done to a high standard, absolutely flawless, and it is done to Rolex level. It's the same mirror polishing that one gets on a Submariner oyster bracelet. The St. Martin also has mirror polished flanks, but the quality of the mirror polishing just isn't as good. There are some ripples and also some micro scratches, so the quality of the machining to the bracelet links isn't as flawless as on the Black Bay 58 rivet links. The mirror polishing itself is done to a high standard, but the actual quality of the machining of the stainless steel links below it aren't as good. So it's very high quality, but it doesn't have the same Rolex-like luster to it. Now, with regards to the clasp, I actually prefer the 004 clasp. It has 4 micro adjustment holes, so it gives more adjustment, and I actually like the proportions of it. It's a heavier gauge of 316L grade stainless steel. The mirror polished bevels on it are more aesthetically pleasing, and I think it's just better looking. I like the solid milled interior, which is brushed satin finish, and it's good to have that micro adjustment. So heavier gauge. Now, with the Black Bay clasp, technically one could argue that the 58's clasp is superior because it has ceramic ball bearings rather than stainless steel, but it only has 3 micro adjustment holes, and I actually think they should have made the clasp slightly longer, and I would prefer if they used a heavier gauge of metal as per the 004. So really there is room for improvement on the clasp. I would like to see Tudor upgrade this to the T-fit clasp they're using on the Black Bay Pro, which is like a glide lock clasp, and that would allow for better fine-tuning the length one would have on the fly adjustment, because the T-fit clasp is like a Rolex glide lock, and that would negate the need for the 3 micro adjustment holes, which just isn't enough. So I actually prefer the 004 2-button push clasp, and I prefer if Tudor used a 2-button push clasp on the 58. So I'll show you the case backs. They're very similar. As you can see, the 58's case back has a sterile centre section, and the specification is engraved around the circumference. It's low profile and coin edge finished, 200 meters of hermetic seal, very smooth and flat against the wrist, so very comfortable to wear. Now on the 004 it has more of a bubble case back, which is more like the bubble case backs used on Rolex pieces rather than being flatter. So the 58's case back is more flat and therefore sits closer to the wrist, and this sits more proud off the wrist, so it lifts the case off the wrist. I prefer the flatter case back on the 58 versus this domed bubble back case back on the 004, but it's sterile, coin edge finished, and it does look very similar. It is finished to a very similar standard. So really in terms of quality of finishing, there's not much difference between the 004's case back and the 58's case back. They both provide 200 meters. So I'll give you a wrist shot of both pieces. Now, in terms of wrist presence, they feel exactly the same. This is 38.5, but it actually wears more like a 39 because there is a slight bezel overhang, so it looks like a 39. Now, there is a difference in the lug to lug, and this is noticeable on wrist. The 004 is shorter. It's 46mm lug to lug. The 58 is 47.6, so it's 1.6 millimeters longer. Now, I would prefer if both pieces had the perfect lug-to-lug measurement, which is 48, because as you'll know from my previous reviews, I consider 48 to be the sweet spot, regardless of whether you have a 6 to 7 inch wrist or a 7 to 8 inch wrist. At 46, this feels 2 millimeters too short, but if you have a smaller wrist of 6 to 7 inches, you will enjoy the short lug-to-lug of 46. I think they should have lengthened it by 2 millimeters, and that would fit larger wrists of 7 to 8 inches better, but it is very close. This is only 1.6 millimeters shorter in lug-to-lug measurement than the 58. Feel good factor is excellent, and also the comfort level is excellent, and in terms of heft, they feel exactly the same because there's only 1 gram of difference. This 004 is 147 grams, the 58 is 146 grams respectively. Visually, this looks more aggressive because it has a thicker gear tooth bezel versus the 58, which has a lower profile coin edge bezel, but the profile of the double dome sapphire crystal is very close. So visually they look very similar, but there is one notable difference. This 004 uses a ceramic bezel insert, and you can see the ceramic bezel insert is actually a better colour match because the blue tone of the ceramic better matches the blue tone of the dial. The other correct decision that San Martin made was they used blue tinted AR coating on the 004. Now on the Black Bay 58 it is white, it's clear, AR coating, and I think they should have used blue tinted because when one tilts the piece at an oblique angle, the blue tinted AR coating actually complements the blue dial. It gives it a nice blue hue. So I'll do the same with a 58 and give you a wrist shot. Now I actually prefer overall the proportions of this 58 because it's 39, so it's 0.5 millimeter wider head of the piece, but visually they look very similar because this has a 39 millimeter case and the 004 has a 39 millimeter bezel, so they look visually similar. I prefer the longer lug-to-lug measurement. This is 1.6 millimeters longer at 47.6, and therefore it better suits my 8-inch wrist. But in terms of fit, the female pivoted end links, which are both 20 millimeters wide, they feel exactly the same. They do the same job of pulling the rivet link bracelet on the 58 and the oyster style bracelet on the 004 down to the wrist very well. So very similar case shape. Now, as you can see, this does have a noticeably thinner, lower profile coin edge bezel, and I actually prefer it because it creates an optical illusion of making the head of the piece look thinner, because the flanks are actually very similar in proportion, but having the lower profile coin edge bezel versus the taller gear tooth bezel means visually this looks like a more slender piece, and it actually makes the double dome sapphire crystal look thicker. So they've got the proportions of the bezel better on the 58 than the 004. Now it feels exactly the same. Comfort level is outstanding, feel good factor is outstanding, but visually I prefer the slimmer look of it. Now it is notable that this is 12 millimeters thick versus the 13.3 of the 004. It does feel like a lower profile piece, and of course it is going to easily slip underneath a shirt cuff because it's 1.3 millimeters thinner. The bracelet feels exactly the same. It's 20, tapering down to 16. I would prefer if it was an oyster link bracelet, but however, the rivet link bracelet is finished to a superior standard, although I do prefer the 004 2-button push clasp, which is longer and a heavier gauge of metal. Now the aluminium bezel insert does give it a different look because it's more reflective, it has that metallic finish. I prefer the silver minute ticks and the silver Arabic numerals of the aluminium bezel insert versus the ceramic, which has more dull look to the minute ticks, the more grey looking, more dull satin finish, and I think the metallic look of the aluminium bezel insert is more aesthetically pleasing than the ceramic, which looks more glossy. So I'll just show you the bezels side by side because it's something to note, and I think that San Martin should have used an aluminium bezel insert as per the Black Bay 58, because as you can see, using an aluminium bezel insert gives it a more vintage aesthetic. It looks more like a 1950s Tudor Submariner, but using the ceramic bezel insert on the 004 makes it look more like a contemporary piece because ceramic is the modern day specification. So I actually prefer the more matte metallic look of the aluminium bezel insert, and I think it works better with a coin edge finish bezel because it's lower profile. The gear tooth bezel looks more aggressive, it looks more contemporary, more like a scalloped bezel on a Submariner, and of course the ceramic is more glossy. As you can see, it's more reflective, but just looking at the minute ticks and the Arabic numerals, you can see on the San Martin 004 It looks more grey and satin. It actually looks more like the platinum inlay on Cerachrome bezels used on the Submariner. But I prefer the more metallic finish, the more silver, shiny, reflective finish to the minute ticks and the Arabic numerals on the aluminium bezel insert. But this is subjective. Some collectors prefer the look of ceramic to aluminium, and of course, subjectively one has to say, yes, the ceramic is harder and more scratch resistant. In terms of the dial layouts, they look exactly the same. The proportions of the snowflake hands are very similar. Both mirror polished snowflake hands, and they both have mirror polished applied indices. I actually prefer the blue tone of the dial on the 004 to the 58 tone, because this has a more matte pale blue colour tone and it doesn't perfectly match the aluminium bezel insert. The dial on the 58 looks slightly too light. On the 004, San Martin deserve credit because they've done a better job of colour matching the tone of blue. It's a deeper blue which matches the deep blue of the ceramic bezel insert. So I think the colour match of the dial to the bezel on the 004 is better done. Tudor need to improve it. They could have made it a better colour match between the midnight blue bezel and the dial. As you can see, there's a slight colour match. But if you look at the double dome sapphire crystals, you can see they are very similar in proportion, although the 58 has a clear AR coating on the underside versus the blue tinted AR coating on the 004. So dimensions are very similar. Now, with regards to the two movements, the 004 limited edition uses the Seiko NH35A automatic, which has a 40-hour power reserve. The 58 uses the Knissi MT5402, which has a 70-hour power reserve. So the 58 is superior because it has an additional 30 hours of power reserve, 70 hours versus 40 hours. But in terms of accuracy, they're actually surprisingly close, because this NH35A in the 004 has been regulated to plus 5 seconds per day. This Knissi MT5402 in the 58 has been regulated to plus 1 second per day. So there's only 4 seconds of accuracy difference between the two. Plus 5 on the 004, plus 1 on the 58. And bearing in mind there's a massive price difference, one has to question, is it really worth paying €3,640 to get plus 1 second per day? Yes, this movement is COSC chronometer certified. And of course the 35A isn't, but this is running at plus 5, which is within COSC chronometer limits of -4 to +6. So really the 35A is good enough. Now the other thing to consider is the servicing cost. The Black Bay 58's movement, which is made by Knissi, the MT5402, it should be serviced every 5 years. Now, with an NH35A, the reality is one never needs to service it. The recommended service interval for the 35A is every 10 years. But in reality, they are never serviced because they quite often run for 10 to 20 years with no servicing whatsoever. And it's actually more inexpensive to replace the 35A with a new movement. It's more cost effective to simply take out the old movement and put a new one in, rather than breaking down the movement, ultrasonically cleaning the parts and then building it back up and regulating it. So the reality is this has a much lower running cost. One doesn't need to service the movement. After 10 years or 20 years, when the movement is worn out, one can simply put a new NH35A movement in. But with this Knissi MT5402, every 5 years it needs to be broken down, ultrasonically cleaned, and the parts need to be built back up, and then it needs to be regulated to within COSC chronometer limits again. So more expensive running cost, one has to service it at a Tudor service centre, and of course the 004 net doesn't need that, so this is a less expensive watch to own through the lifetime. Now with regards to the dial, I prefer the silver text on the 58 versus the white text, but the colour tone match is better on the 004. I do prefer the aluminium bezel insert on the 58. Right, so let's do a lume test between the two pieces. Let's compare them side by side, and we'll see how the lume performs on both pieces when they're charged up to the absolute maximum. Right, so that's now fully charged, and I'll charge up the 58 and then we'll look at them side by side. Right, so that's now fully charged. Now as you can see, there is a difference in the colour of the lume. On the 004 on the left, it's BGW9 Superlume Nova, which has a blue tone, very aesthetically pleasing. On the right, it looks more like C3 Superlume Nova on the 58, which has a green tone. Now, I like both, but if I had to choose one, I prefer the green tone of C3 because the Super Lume Nova used on the 58 has a more vintage aesthetic. It looks more like tritium lume, which was used on the Tudor Snowflake Submariner in the 1970s. But however, one could argue that the BGW9 is performing better because it's brighter. The blue always seems to look brighter than the green, although they are both clearly Super Lume Nova, and we're clearly looking at 5 to 6 layers. In terms of colour match, there's a good colour match between the Lume pip, the dial and the hands on the 004, and of course there's a good colour match between the green tone on the 58's Lume pip, dial and hands. Proportions of the snowflake hands are very similar, and the proportions of the indices are also very similar. So as you can see, there's no real difference in performance. They're both glowing very brightly, and they will continue to glow for a good length of time, which is what one would expect with 5 to 6 layers of Super Lume Nova, regardless of whether it's BGW9 on the left or C3 on the right. So I prefer the green, but really, in terms of performance, there is no difference. And San Martin deserve full credit because there is a massive price difference between these two pieces. And the quality of the BGW9 Super Lume Nova that San Martin are using is top grade. It's very good. Now, if you look closely at the hour hand on the 004, you can see the lume isn't applied as evenly as on the 58s. You can see on the snowflake hour hand, it is more thick and evenly applied in the square section of the snowflake. So Tudor have done a better job, as one would expect, but I think the lume performance on the 004 is outstanding, and San Martin really have done a good job of it. Right, so let's compare the bezel actions. Now, I like the bezel action of the 004. They've got the balance just right. It's not too tight and it's not too loose. It feels lighter than a Steinhardt Ocean 139. Feels very similar to a Seiko Turtle or a Seiko 5KX. Nice loud audible clicks. Now this has 120 click unidirectional bezel. I prefer 120 clicks. The 58 has 60 clicks, which has a more vintage feel to it. I prefer the finer clicks of the 120 versus 60. No lateral side-to-side play, no back play. This is a very well executed bezel and very satisfying to use because the gear tooth profile to the teeth are very well machined. They're very well finished. They don't have sharp points. I actually sold my 008 because that had a coin edge bezel, but I didn't like the teeth, which were sharp. They had sharp points to the top, so it didn't feel pleasant to use. I prefer the feeling of this 004 bezel to the 008 I previously owned. So the bezel is an absolute pleasure to use, and the resistance is perfect. I like the fact it's lighter than an Ocean 139, very similar to a Seiko bezel action, so the perfect bezel execution. So let's compare it to the Black Bay 58. Now this does have louder audible clicks, and the clicks feel heavier and they sound heavier because it has 60 clicks rather than 120. So the clicks feel larger, there's a bigger space in between the ratcheting mechanism. Feels even all the way through the resistance. Very similar resistance to the 004. Again, it feels lighter than a Steinhardt Ocean 139. Feels very similar to a Seiko 5KX or a Seiko Turtle bezel action. That's the kind of resistance, not too light and not too heavy. Needless to say, no lateral side-side play, no back play, and we have perfect alignment. So this is 10 out of 10. But really, there isn't much of a difference between the 004's bezel action and this 58's bezel action. In terms of resistance, they feel very similar. And I actually prefer the feeling of the coin edge bezel because it's lower profile and there's no sharp edges, no points. So this is better than on the 008, which I sold to replace it with the 004. I prefer the feeling of the coin edge bezel because the teeth are finer, and on an index finger and thumb without a glove it actually feels smoother. Although it is grippy, it does feel tactile. So if I had to choose between the two, I actually prefer the feeling of the 58's coin edge bezel. Now visually this is clearly lower profile, and as I've discussed, it does create an optical illusion because it makes the head of the piece look thinner, even though the flanks are actually very similar proportion. So this does look like 12mm. Now it's noticeable if you look at the side profile, although the flanks to the cases are very close in dimensions, this is clearly 1.3mm thicker overall, and it creates an optical illusion because the taller gear tooth bezel actually makes the piece look thicker because the bezel is more aggressive. So I'll just show it side by side or above each other. Now you can see the 58's bezel is actually much lower profile. The coin edge bezel is more slender. The gear tooth bezel on the 004 is noticeably thicker, and it does create that optical illusion. On wrist, this does look like 12mm, and on wrist, this does look like 13.3. It does look 1.3mm thicker. So I actually think San Martin could improve the gear tooth bezel. They could reduce the thickness of it, or alternatively, they could use the 008 coin edge bezel, but refine the finishing because it does have sharp points, whereas the Black Bay 58 has a smoother finish to the teeth. So I actually prefer the look of the coin edge bezel with the aluminium bezel insert, but I also like the gear tooth profile to the 004's bezel with ceramic bezel insert. It looks more aggressive and more contemporary. So really it's subjective whether you prefer the lower profile coin edge bezel versus the higher profile gear tooth bezel of the 004. The double dome sapphire crystals look very similar, although I do prefer the blue tinted AR coating on the 004 versus the clear AR coating on the underside of the 58. Right, so let's compare the screw down crown execution side by side. Now this has a knurled finish, mirror polished domed cap. Now they have updated this. They are now selling the 004 limited edition with a hex crown, which is good, versus this S crown, and I prefer that. This does feel silky smooth. Now it's not as silky smooth as a Rolex twin lock or trip lock crown, but it is excellent. It does feel very smooth to unscrew. And in terms of manual winding, the 35A is an absolute pleasure to manually wind. It feels smoother than the PT5000, and I actually prefer that this 004 uses the 35A versus the PT5000 because the 35A is much smoother to manually wind. Now pulling it out to the final click position is the time setting position, and it's got a nice firm resistance but no back play clockwise and anti-clockwise. The negative of this having the 35A is there is a phantom date setting position. There is a date setting position. I would prefer had they used the 38 because that would delete it. But pushing it back in, it's got a nice positive click. And screwing it back down, there's an immediate thread pickup. Now the thread pickup on this is better than on San Martins that use the PT5000 because one has to really push in the PT5000, but it's very spring loaded. There's a lot of resistance on the winding stem. One has to really force it in to get the screw down crown to pick up on the external thread of the stainless steel crown tube. So I prefer the action unscrewing and screwing back down the 35A powered San Martin pieces such as this 004 versus the PT5000 versions. So let's compare it to the 58. So we've got a coin edge finish. Now I prefer the coin edge finish to the knurled finish on the 004 because it better matches the coin edge finish of the bezel. Coin edge screw down crowns feel better to grip because the coin edge finishing is finer than the knurled finishing. And as you can see, it's finished to a high standard with an embossed Tudor crown. Mirror polishing is flawless. This is silky smooth. This is the ultimate in screw down crown execution. It feels exactly the same as a Rolex twin lock crown or a Rolex trip lock crown respectively. There is no discernible difference between a Black Bay 58 crown and the crowns that Rolex are using on the Submariner, for example. So this doesn't have a phantom date setting position. There's no date complication. We don't have a date wheel on the Kinesi caliber MT5402. So in the first position, it's the manual wind position, and one can manually wind it to its maximum 70 hours. Now the thing to note is this does have an additional 30 hours of power reserve. It's a 70-hour movement versus the 40 hours of the NH35A. But it takes longer to manually wind. With the 35A, 40 clockwise turns is enough to fully wind it to its maximum. So when the 35A is dead, the movement is completely exhausted. One can manually wind it 40 times clockwise, and that will manually wind it to its limits. It's 40 hours. Now with the Kinesi MT5402, it has 70 hours, and it actually takes more turns. 40 isn't enough to fully wind a 70-hour movement. It actually takes closer to 70 winds. So that's something to bear in mind. It's actually more time consuming to manually wind the movement initially up to its maximum. But having said that, once it is fully wound, of course this has 70 hours of power reserve. It nearly has 3 days of power reserve. So it is superior. It does feel silky smooth, light resistance. One can feel the tension in the mainspring gradually building up. It's very smooth to manually wind, far superior to the 35A and much smoother than the PT5000. Pulling it out to the first click is the final click position. This has a lighter resistance to the gearing, so it's more pleasant to set the time. Feels very light resistance, no friction whatsoever, and of course no back play clockwise and anti-clockwise. Pushing it back in, it's got a nice light click, and of course that restarts the movement. Let's test screwing it back down. Immediate thread pickup. This is sublime. This is Rolex level quality. It feels just like a Rolex twin lock or Rolex trip lock crown. That's the smoothness. It really cannot be improved upon. This is the ultimate screw down crown execution. So I prefer the screw down crown execution on the 58, but really San Martin deserve credit because their 35A screw down crown execution, it really doesn't feel that far off the Black Bay 58. It's not as smooth. There is some more friction. One can feel the friction of the rubber O-ring inside the screw down crown and the second rubber O-ring inside the crown tube, so there is more friction, but in terms of the threading, the interface between the internal thread of the stainless steel crown and the external thread of the stainless steel crown tube, they are smooth, they are well machined. Tudor does it better, but of course one would expect that because this is €3,640. This is only €240, but the smoothness is superior on the 58, but the 004 isn't far behind. So lastly, I'll summarise both pieces. What do I think of them overall? Well, when I'm considering reviewing a watch on my channel, the watch meet two criteria. It should be both excellent quality and excellent value at the respective price points. So as I detailed in my review of this piece, it is unquestionably excellent quality and unquestionably excellent value. At €240, this is the ultimate Black Bay 58 homage. It cannot be beaten. €240 is outstanding because the specification is loaded, 200 metres, blue tinted AR coating, ceramic bezel insert, BGW9, and the 35A is the correct choice. It's less expensive than using the PT5000, but this is running at plus 5 seconds, which is outstanding. No negatives to this whatsoever. The only negative was that it used the S crown, but that's now been rectified. Later versions use the hex crown, so it's the perfect 58 homage. And the only thing I would change to it, I would like to see them use the coin edge bezel used on the 008, but refine it, better finish it, so it doesn't have the sharp points to the teeth. I would also prefer if it had mirror polish to the flanks rather than brushed satin finish, but this is subjective. And of course I prefer the oyster bracelet that this uses, but it is also available on the rivet link bracelet because some collectors prefer it. So outstanding piece, champagne watch for lemonade money. Now we'll do the same. Consider this, €3,640, massive price difference. Is it worth paying the additional premium for this? This is €3,600 versus €240. Overall, yes, the quality of the finishing is higher grade. This is Rolex level finishing. The brushed satin finishing has a better quality luster. The mirror polishing is flawless. So the quality of the machining, the finishing, the quality control, the build quality on this is higher grade. It is Rolex level. But in terms of specification, they're not actually that different. Yes, this has 70 hours power reserve versus 40 hours. But the Lume performance is equal. It uses C3 Superluminova versus BGW9. Clear AR coating versus blue tinted AR coating. They're both 200 metres. The reality is the ceramic bezel inset on the 004 is superior because it is more hard and scratch resistant than the aluminium bezel insert. And in terms of the bezel execution, the screw down crown execution, they are actually quite close. The female pivoted end links do actually feel very similar, so the articulation is very similar, although this has smoother articulation. And of course the bracelet is better finished in terms of the build quality of the 1.6mm screws. They are better finished. But ironically, I would say that the San Martin clasp is better, both in terms of it's more aesthetically pleasing, better proportions, heavier gauge of stainless steel. I prefer the 2 button pushers rather than the flip lock, although this does have ceramic ball bearings, so that is technically superior. But if I had to choose between the two, I would say the San Martin clasp looks better. I prefer the heavier gauge, and really the finishing isn't that different. I also prefer that it has 4 micro adjustments versus 3. So the San Martin clasp is better, really, than the flip lock clasp made by Tudor. So it's ironic because the 004 is a less expensive piece. I would say to you, the 58 is a better quality piece and a credible alternative to the Submariner. But if you cannot afford €3,640 for the Black Bay 58, then this 004 limited edition is a credible alternative, because if you look at them, they are actually very similar looking, both 200 meters. This is plus 5 seconds per day, this is plus 1. They are only 4 seconds per day accuracy difference. And the reality is, it's not worth paying the additional €3,400 to get 4 seconds per day better accuracy. And really, I think the 004 is a champagne watch for lemonade money, and closer to value and quality than this 58 is. Really, one could say that this 58 is poor value in comparison to the 004. I like both pieces, I've enjoyed wearing both pieces, but now I have the 58, I've decided to sell the 004 because clearly I'm not going to wear both pieces. So I hope you've liked my comparison of the San Martin SN004-G limited edition with my Tudor Black Bay 58. Please feel free to post your own comments below the video. Thank you very much.